Everything happened in the year 2063, when a VR game called Sword and Magic was sold. It was a VR MMORPG where you could play as characters of different races and fight using swords and magic. At the moment when the protagonist was about to leave the game, something was waiting for him. A blonde-haired girl came up to the hero and wished Mr. Pein a good morning. The protagonist sat on the throne of the Demon King and said that this day has finally come. Pein was the king of Gloria Septim and was a sword and magic player. This cooperative game was an unexpected success. Pein tried to unite the different races to achieve world domination. The capture mode in the game is only available to the 7 weakest, among the 35 types of races provided in Sword and Magic. He himself made his character one of these dwarf races. In the beginning, he could not handle even the easiest of opponents, and that's how the game ended for him. But if pumped properly, it was fashionable to become strong, regardless of race. Pein created a kingdom called Gloria Septim. They developed and had already taken over a quarter of the world. Pein was approached by a girl that asked the hero what they should do next. They were waiting for his orders. The girl was an elf whose name was Lala. Elves were beautiful and strong, but had no special status. They were good with a bow, but their damage left much to be desired. The characters' facial expressions are quite monotonous, not at all like real people. This was quite bad for a VR game. The girl was waiting for orders and the hero decided that he was tired for the day, going to leave the game. He used the exit function. A sign appeared in front of Pein to choose if he really wanted to leave the game. While waiting to exit, Pein thought about the fact that everything was going on for what seemed like a long time and everything around him was black. He decided that in all likelihood something had happened. When the guy finally saw a fuzzy picture in front of his eyes, he was glad that something had appeared. It was a girl who called out for Mr. Pein. It was Lala, who was madly happy that Mr. Pein woke up. The hero found himself on the bed and didn't understand why the elven girl in front of him. The girl replied that the Lord had been sleeping for 3 whole days and she was beginning to worry about him. This was strange, for the feeling in Pepin's mind was quite different. Lala was worried and assumed that the Lord was sick. The guy looked at the girl and was surprised. Sword and Magic had never had such amazing graphics. It was as if the game had become a reality. The guy decided to wait a bit and thought about it for a while, not believing his eyes. Pein looked at his hands in horror and thought he had entered another world. But that was impossible. The Ice Sky was at the peak of popularity a few decades ago, and now it had become a classic. The girl was still looking at the hero and asking what should she do for the Lord. Pein reached out to the girl and apologized for that. His hand touched her cheek and the girl immediately blushed, sighing heavily. The hero touched her ear as if he was touching a living person. His touch made the elven girl close her eyes. No VR game has ever been this realistic yet. As the hero tried touching the girl from top to bottom, he wasn't sure if such a game could even exist. Lala embarrassedly said Mr. Pepin's name. The boy stood pensively on his feet, and the Devshuka thought he was done. Pein pinched and pulled his cheek, which startled the girl. Lala couldn't understand what Mr. Pein was doing. In VR games, it was possible to feel mild pain by changing the settings. It was forbidden by law to connect pain sensations. Even if you hit your pinky toe on a cabinet in the game, you would feel almost nothing. The software itself was programmed that way, so no firmware or mods could help. If the world of Sword and Magic became a reality, the hero couldn't understand why he wasn't on the throne right now. He didn't realize where he was now. Before he left the game, he was in the royal palace and decided to think. Pein was horrified and assumed that this was the same hut he had built at the beginning of the game. It is quite possible that after he moved here, his kingdom disappeared and only his first hut remained. And of all his subordinates, it was the Lala who got him, the worst case scenario. And this was all after all his suffering. The boy asked the girl if Lala knew where they were, but the elf shook her head sadly that she did not know. Pein wondered what had happened to Gloria Septim. Lala had no time to realize she was here, so it was just the two of them. The girl replied that it was not so, because the others were also here. They were the Goblin Gus, the Titan Nobo, and the Kobold Pachai. as well as the wise demon Eri and the harpy Fasia. All but her had gone on a scouting trip to learn more about the place. She, however, stayed behind and tended to Mr. Peperin. The guy thought that there was no one else here besides Lala and the others. Lala was alarmed and thought that Mr. Peperin needed rest, but the hero replied that he was fine. He just wanted some fresh air, so he went to the door. Lala replied that she would go with him. When Peperin opened the doors and saw his surroundings in front of him, he could not believe his eyes. They were on the plain of Talsheim. It was here, on the plain of Talsheim, that he had established his first base. He expanded his territory. First there was a village, then a township, and then a city. This is how he established Gloria Septim. Peperin was furious that all of this was now gone. Just as he had thought, his kingdom was gone. Lala suddenly started talking about Gloria Septim, and was clearly upset that Gloria was gone. Guy calmed down and decided that it was quite likely. He also wondered what status they had now. If the country disappeared, then they should not exist. But judging by the outfit, everything was in order. Peperin requested status and waited for a window to appear, but nothing happened. Nothing came up, and the hero thought how they could find out the status now. He decided to try jumping up. Peperin made a jump and flew high above the ground, which surprised Lala. All the basic parameters were normal and did not change. If the jump height was the same, it could be assumed that the other parameters were unchanged as well. The hero decided to ask Lala if her status had changed. Lala confirmed that it had. And the status didn't change just like the others. In that case, the guy decided to check the magic. Extending his hand, Peperin summoned a flame and thought everything was working. He decided to test it differently. By changing the position of his hands, he used a giant flame. All they knew now was that this was the world of sword and magic. He thought that since nothing had changed, he would be able to use all of his spells. But it seems only entry-level magic was available to him. Along with his subordinates, the hero was transported here, and Gloria Septim was gone. The parameters remained the same, but the use of magic was limited. Peperin looked at Lala, who was now not an NPCS. If that was the case, then the others should have feelings as well. In sword and magic at a low level of trust, a player's subordinates could betray him. Judging from Lala's behavior, her trust was still at its maximum. That was probably how it should have been for the others. But it wasn't clear what would happen next. It was unknown what his subordinates would think when they found out that his country was gone. If they became hostile, they could revolt. If it was just a game, Peperin wouldn't care in any way. Suddenly, a shout was heard from behind. Before the hero could turn around, a girl rushed to his neck. Glad that the gentleman woke up, she pressed him to her with all her might. Dropping him on the ground from surprise, the girl squeaked how worried she was about him. Lala blushed and wanted to porpoise Fasia to stop. She could not understand what Fasia was allowing herself and ordered her to quickly unhook herself from her master by grabbing her by the scruff of the neck. Fasia was a harpy that carried wings. Despite this, they were unable to fly, plus their attack power and defense were extremely low compared to other characters. Therefore, most players disliked this race. She couldn't understand what was happening to Lala and puffed up her cheeks. Lala couldn't turn a blind eye to Mr. Peperin's rough treatment, but the harpy wasn't sure if she had done anything wrong and asked the hero if he was against it. Peperin replied that he was okay with it, but Lala yelled that she forbade such a thing. A guy with horns showed up at the door, wondering why it was so noisy. Lala's screams were coming from the house, saying that Peperin was spoiling his fantasy too much. The lad was glad the Lord was finally awake. It was the Goblin Gus, which was one of the most popular non-strong races, and this game was no exception. Of all the 7 weak races, they were the fastest, so they could still be used. Gus said that the others would be approaching them now. A girl named Eri appeared in the doorway and announced her arrival. She was a wise demon named Eri. All of her characteristics were low, except for her high intelligence and magic. Because of her appearance, many players tried to befriend this race to have them act as mascots. With her was a tall and pumped-up beast-like man who was also happy that Mr. Peperin was awake. It was the Kobold Pachai. They had the so-called beast transformation skill, but they couldn't use it. They were also called bipedal dogs. Seeing his team, the hero was glad they were back. Pein only wondered where Nobo was, but then he heard Nobo's voice behind him. A large shadow loomed over the hero. Nobo was a titan and apologized for being outside. His race was simply huge. Also, they were very strong, but their speed left much to be desired. Their attack power belonged to the top class, but they didn't use it fully. The hero realized that Nobo was too big to go inside. In that case, the guy decided that the Oin would all go outside. Nobo panicked. He couldn't force Mr. Pein to go outside for him. But Mr. Pein smiled and answered him that he couldn't just leave one of his subordinates outside. When everyone gathered and went outside, the hero thanked the group for coming and asked them to report on the situation. Gus decided to start with him and said that he was heading northeast. The landscape there was still intact and everything looked the same as it had before Glorious Septum was created. In the same direction were the Burkham Caves, where they had previously destroyed all the monsters and built a mine. The same monsters that were there before were now dwelling there. Titan Nobo said that he went on a reconnaissance in the northwest direction. Nothing had changed except that all the structures that were supposed to be there had disappeared. In addition, Lake Fauna was still in the northwest, but the large farm around it had disappeared. Fasia talked about her exploration in the west. She was sad that she couldn't fly, so Mr. Pein had built a castle for her. But unfortunately, it was also gone. She was very sorry about that. Pachai told about the exploration in the eastern side. There used to be a pasture where he kept a captured dragon, but now there was nothing there. Nobo was extremely saddened by this, for he had to travel all over the world to catch the dragon on the king's orders. The last to report was Irai, who went south. In the south was to be the volcano Rufel. There was a mana extraction place she had created after much research, but unfortunately there was nothing left. It was a shame that the fruits of such hard work had just disappeared. This place reminded the hero of the past where they had returned to, where Glorious Septum was not yet. If indeed their country was no more, Pein thought of disbanding their group. In the game, of course, he was a good king who led his subordinates, but he wasn't sure he would do the same in the event that all this was reality. In the present, he was just an ordinary student. In the end, he would drag them through like nothing, and they would obviously hate him. The group asked the hero what they should do, since there was nothing else left. Pein thought he could live without his friends, for he had all the knowledge he needed. He decided to tell the group that this is where they should have separated. He asked everyone to listen as he was suddenly interrupted by Lala that he asked if they knew what had happened to them. Starting with a small hut, increasing the number of subordinates and researching technology, strengthening them, the weak, increasing the number of people, creating settlements and cities, and afterward a country, the hero was able to conquer other nations and build the most powerful Glorious Septum in the world in just one generation. This is exactly how Lala envisioned the great hero, Mr. Pein. She believed that if they all followed Mr. Pepin's lead, they could revive Glorious Septum right here and conquer this world. The group agreed with her, and Pein just stood there in shock watching all of this. Gus replied that it was all because their king was the coolest. The Harpy agreed. She believed that their lord would be able to build a castle in the sky once more. He would be able to create a utopia where no one would starve. Pachai was willing to go anywhere with his master, because he would never be bored. Eri also said that if they researched advanced technology, they would surely revive Glorious Septum soon. Pein opened his mouth in surprise and his crown came off. He thought about how it wouldn't be good if things continued like this. He fully realized that he should have given up on this. Even though he realized it, he couldn't. He felt uncomfortable looking at his devoted group. It was simply impossible to refuse in such a situation. The guy thought about the fact that he was an ordinary Japanese, and if he couldn't solve such a situation, then he wouldn't bear it anymore. The guy smiled and asked his friends to trust him. After all, he is the great hero of Pein. Clenching his fist, he proposed to his friends to revive Glorious Septum again and conquer this world. Everyone raised their hands in the air and supported the hero. Thus began the world domination of Pein. The second conquest of another world begins with the binding of 7 weak races. The first thing they needed to do was 3 things, and the hero decided that his group knew what he was talking about. Eri guessed, and replied that they needed to make money first, and then get provisions and water. They also need to gather building materials to expand their base. That was exactly what Pein was talking about. Lala thought about what they should do and suggested that they divide the duties. They could divide into 3 groups. The first group would be responsible for getting provisions and water, the second group for supplying materials, and the last group for the treasury. They thought about how they would divide the roles. For water and provisions, Fasia and Gus would end up being responsible. Nobo and Pachai would be responsible for the materials. Then Lala with Mr. Pein and Eri would be in charge of the treasury. Titan Nobo thought they had a good division of duties, but wasn't sure if everyone would be allowed to leave their base. But Pein replied that there was nothing of value in this base, so it was fine. Of course, there was a chance that this hut would be destroyed. It wasn't 0, but it wouldn't be difficult to build it again. The hero waved his hand, in which case he ordered everyone to get to their duties. To begin with, the task of Pepin's group was to fill the treasury. If he wasn't mistaken, there was a Cyclops lair southwest of here. Rhea agreed with the Lord's thoughts. Lala blushed, remembering how Mr. Pein had defeated them beautifully last time. In Sword and Magic, the lairs of dangerous boss-class monsters were located in different places, and there were many rare items that could be sold for a good price. If this world has returned to its original state, there should definitely be a Cyclops lair there. If their statuses hadn't changed, it wouldn't be difficult to defeat them. Lala expected exactly that from their master, suggesting to deal with them quickly. When the hero's group approached the rocks, the guy said it was here. He smelled a horrible odor and immediately covered his nose from it. That was exactly what the smell of real decay was. Not paying any attention to the smell, Eri looked ahead and said she spotted their den. Lala and Eri approached the den and cautiously looked inside. Right in front of them sat a healthy Cyclops that turned around and noticed the uninvited guests. Grasping his huge club, the Cyclops banged it on the ground in front of the hero. Pein noticed that the Cyclops looked more difficult in reality than in the game. It was like invading a house without permission, killing the owner and stealing everything precious. Cyclops swung his baton at Pein, and the hero decided there was nothing to do. He recoiled from the blow, and pulling out his sword decided it was all about money. Swinging his sword, he jumped at the Cyclops in return. With one swing, he flew through him, severing his arm, which flew off to the side. The Cyclops screamed as he looked at the severed arm and grabbed at it. Eri used flames on the wounded Cyclops, which burned it. As the monster fell dead, Eri exhaled a sigh of relief. Lala noticed that they could manage without her, but they still needed to gather all the treasures. They saw a chest and a couple of sacks near the cave wall. Eri tried to open the treasure chest, but it was locked and wouldn't open. Lala pointed her finger and said that with her lockpicking skill, they would open it without a problem. The girl conjured several lockpicks that were held by magic in the air. She used one lockpick to start with, and then used a couple more pieces, after which the treasure chest was opened. The chest contained many gems, plus a book of magic. Eri recognized the book and said that it was storm magic. If she wasn't mistaken, the book was level 5. It certainly wasn't strong, but it was better than level 8 flame magic. Lala gathered everything they could sell into one chest. The closest town from here was Kors, and the hero motioned for them to move out. Fasia and Gus's group set off to find water and provisions. After looking at the Hulk, the Harpy decided to ask his partner if it was possible to eat such a Hulk. Gus didn't know, but looking at the prey decided to find out and try it. They looked at the huge snake, which was by all appearances dangerous. Fasia thought of the gentleman's liking for such things. But Gus didn't know what the hero's favorite food was, and yet he didn't think he would like such a thing. Fasia immediately snickered and decided that in such a case, it wasn't worth it. There was no point in doing it if the Lord wouldn't be satisfied. But Gus thought that Pein would be pleased with anything the Harpy brought him. The girl's eyes lit up again, and she decided that in that case, she would bring the snake to the Lord. She immediately rushed to the attack without waiting for Gus. Gus looked glumly at Fasia, who had already run away. He decided that she was more than enough to defeat such an enemy and went in search of water. Fasia, meanwhile, had already caught up with the monster. The harpy was fast and started running around the snake, confusing it. It taunted it and shouted that it was here, right in front of it. The snake lost its temper and pounced on Fasia. Suddenly, the harpy had disappeared and the snake started looking around. Fasia shouted that she was sorry, being on top of the snake, which did not notice her. The girl drew her sword and pierced the snake. It was enough for her to kill it and bring it to the ground. Standing next to the dead snake, the harpy jumped on the spot and exclaimed that she had killed it. The deed was done. Nobo and Pachai, meanwhile, were in charge of gathering materials. First of all, they needed wood to make anything. Now Mr. Pachai's sword came into play. Pachai asked Nobo to listen to him. He told his partner that his sword was for protecting important people, not for cutting trees. He would not forgive anyone who got in Mr. Pepperin's way. However, he could not sit idly by without his duties. It seemed to Nobo that Pachai's useless big sword was only good for chopping trees, suggesting that he couldn't do that either. Pachai got angry and asked him to do it again. Standing up on his feet and swinging his sword, Pachai replied that he can do anything. He's the captain of the Septum Strike team, and chopping down trees is a cakewalk for him. He could not understand how Nobo could doubt him, so he thought it might be necessary to silence him with his own hands. But Nobo replied that in all probability his hand would be weaker than Fasia's. But they had no other means of cutting down, so the Titan suggested that he thought it was for the sake of their lord. Swinging his huge sword, Pachai thought there was nothing to be done about it, and cursing Nobo felled several trees at once. As Nobo took up a tree, he looked in Pachai's direction and decided that such a speed of work would make the woodcutter shed a tear. Only stumps remained of the trees. Nobo remarked that his partner was overdoing it, and that it would be better to save nature. Pachai looked nervously at Nobo, and replied that in that case he should have told him from the beginning how many trees were needed. Next they needed to carry the stones, and Pachai snickered when he realized they weren't done yet. Trees alone weren't enough, and they needed to gather other useful materials as well. As they approached the stone cliffs, Pachai decided that they needed to be chopped down as well. Nobo, needing his hand, said that it wasn't necessary. He could handle it himself, hitting the rock afterward, which began to fall apart. Pachai sighed and thought that this was exactly what one would expect from a Titan. Taking a large piece in his hands, Nobo replied that he would carry the piece. Pachai asked to watch that he didn't hurt himself, and Nobo assured him it was fine. Suddenly the ground began to shake and a stone golem appeared right in front of them. The golem hit the ground and Nobo smiled. He thought his kick was a little weak. Pachai jumped up, ending up behind the golem's back and swung his sword to strike. The golem turned into a pile of rocks, and Nobo replied to Pachai that they were lucky, and he was surprised at that. Nobo said of the golem's stones, they were simply mesmerizing. They were easy to work, easier than normal stones. Pachai thought that was really good, and offered to take them too. The treasury collection team consisted of Pepperin, Lala, and Irei, who made it to the location. Pepperin suggested to start by selling all the gems and taking everything they needed. Iri would like to buy many spell books. They also needed to buy tools to help them in building and processing materials. They needed to buy as many as they could, after which they would return back. Suddenly, someone ordered Pepperin's group to stop. It was a guard that noticed an elf, a wise demon, and a hero from the dwarf race. He asked what they were holding. He thought it was strange that weak races like them were walking around here so freely. Pepperin could not understand what could be suspicious here. The only people who shouldn't be allowed into the country were orcs, and their races shouldn't be affected in any way. The guard suggested that they could have been runaway slaves who had stolen their master's belongings and escaped. The guy was just shocked, and told the guard that they had just come to sell the treasure from the Cyclops' lair. The guard couldn't believe such a thing. He said he would detain them and investigate. The guard called his aides, saying there were suspects. Suddenly, Pepperin's team was in a quandary. The heroes seemed too suspicious for a guard, and Pein thought about how they could get out of this unforeseen situation. The easiest option would be to simply run away. Making an enemy in the form of a neighboring town was not the best option to start the game. The hero thought to leave this place, but suddenly someone's voice asked to listen to him. Lala pointed her finger at the guard and asked if he understood who he was talking to. She shouted to him that it was the famous hero, the founder of the once established first great power of Glorious Septum, Mr. Pein. Pein was shocked and grabbed the girl's hand and ordered the others to flee. The guards realized they were running away and decided to catch up with them. Lala ran after the hero, but didn't understand why they were leaving. Pein only suggested they find another option after they got out. Eri thought this suggestion was a good one. Apparently, the situation in Kors had changed a bit. After a while, the guards were exhausted. The intruders were too fast for them. Breaking away from the chase, Pepin's group stopped. This city was definitely Kors. The hero was sure that dwarves, elves, and wise demons should be able to visit it, and Eri was in total agreement with the guy. Sure, the demon race liked to be looked down upon a bit, but it was never dismissed as it was here. The elven girl remembered that when she used to visit Kors before, she always quietly got in and shopped for something. Pein thought about the fact that the world of sword and magic had become real, and its rules might have changed just like that. In the days of the game, despite being a weak race, he was never neglected. But if all the less powerful nations were treated like this now, they wouldn't be able to trade. The city was a very important place to acquire blueprints for plantations, laboratories, and other facilities needed to develop the base. They had to figure out something to get them as soon as possible. It was obvious to Pein that the position towards them had changed. Lala had thought about it too, and it would be problematic for them to trade now. Lala lost her temper and suggested that they just conquer the city of Kors. Pein and Eri gloomed and said that wasn't a good idea. The hero had one option, but realizing it would not be easy for him. If Eri hid her tail, ordinary people wouldn't be able to recognize her. Eri looked at her tail and said it was true. She could pretend to be a human and buy what was necessary for them. The elven thought the guards had already managed to memorize her face, but Rai had covered it with a book, so it was fine. In case of failure, Pein offered to come up with another solution. First of all, when she entered the city, they needed to sell the gems. They needed blueprints for a plantation, a research center, a decent-looking house, and things like that. The guy had also asked Eri to get as many books as possible that raised agrarian and architectural skills, as well as magical almanacs. It would also be nice to have a backpack so that he could carry tools for building and material handling in it. Eri asked what to do in case she didn't have enough for everything. Pein asked her in such a case to choose the most needed things at her discretion. Eri hid her tail and took the trunk and placed it on her head. The girl headed towards the city and the hero, and Lala wished her luck. After Eri entered the town, she thought the guards were a little hesitant, but she was still able to get through. If an ordinary girl effortlessly carried a treasure chest, she would be surprised too. Pein thought that for a while, they would have to entrust Eri to go shopping. It was good to possess cloaking magic, but it was level 3, so it was unlikely to be sold in the city. The Elfess decided to clarify if the hero still definitely didn't want to take over Kors for prospects in the future. The hero was shocked with her, and tried to remember if Lala had always been so belligerent. She was very different from the one in the game. But it wasn't worth forgetting that this city wasn't on its own. Kors was under the jurisdiction of the Linuxal state, so since the heroes only had low-level magic on their hands, going to war against an entire country, they had little chance of winning. Lala irritably bit her fingernail and thought that this was just the way it was. But she couldn't stand the way the guards were treating Govpit and Pein. She was simply furious. It took a while for Eri to get back to them with the shoppers. She was carrying a huge, stuffed backpack behind her that was twice her size. The gems were quite expensive, so she was able to buy everything she needed. The guy praised Eri for a good job. He was also curious about what had changed in the town. The girl told him that everything at first glance looked exactly the same as before. But she didn't see any of their 7 races. Kors was still dominated by the 3-eyed ones. It became clear to the hero, if other cities had the same situation, it could be a problem for them. Here, Pein suddenly had an idea. After all, it wasn't a game now, and it wasn't necessary to rely on any race. He continued to be guided by the established rules, but here things had changed. Pein shouted to the girls that he had a great idea. He suggested they return to the base, and Eri and Lala agreed. After dragging all the items home, the heroes gathered everything they needed. Looking at everything the others had dragged in, Pein was simply shocked and didn't realize how they were able to gather all of this in just a few hours. This was what it meant to have capable subordinates. The harpy grabbed her stomach, which rumbled, and told the others that she was hungry. Guy looked at what they had brought for lunch. He found it hard to believe that they had brought a snake. Fasia was proud of herself, and happily declared that she had worked very hard to defeat it. She was curious about her king's opinion, and asked if she was really tough. Unsure if he could eat it, the hero still praised the harpy and said she was smart. Eri wondered how they were going to eat it. Gus suggested cutting up a huge chunk and frying it. He also looked at Pachai, who should have done well with the first item. Pachai didn't understand why everyone around him kept thinking his sword was some kind of tool. First it was an axe, then it was a kitchen sword. Gus didn't understand what was wrong with it. While they were arguing, the harpy exclaimed that he could handle it himself, and used 1,000 blows on the snake carcass. The relentless blows simply shredded the snake. When the harpy finished, she asked the others for their opinions. Nobo took one of the pieces, and smiling said that this size was just perfect for roasting. Eri decided to start a fire, and now it wouldn't be a problem for them to eat. Pachai thought Fasia was insane. He didn't understand why use such a technique to just slice a snake. Just a little more, and they could keep her company in the food bowl. The harpy laughed and apologized to him. Starving, Eri and Fasia didn't understand why the meat was so slow to cook. Eri thought it was just the right time to eat. Lala asked to be allowed to try it first, and took a bite. The taste of it shocked her. Even without marinating, the savoriness of the big snake is excellent. After 1,000 blows had shredded her to pieces, she still continued to resist. Lala found its flavor a bit strange, but apparently the meat was not poisonous, so it was okay to eat. The hero thought this report was very humble, though she herself looked like she hadn't tasted anything tastier. Eri was already chewing on the meat and offered to take a piece to Pein. Pein agreed and started chewing the meat. Surprisingly, he thought it was pretty good. When everyone had eaten, the hero suggested that the group start building the base, and everyone agreed. They needed blueprints, and Pachai suggested they start with woodworking. If a saw was needed, there was one lying nearby. Pein watched the work and thought about erecting buildings. When it was a game, everything was handled by his subordinates. But Lala smiled at Mr. Pein and suggested that he just rest, placing a chair in front of him. Pein agreed with her. Even when things became real, he could only sit and watch. Of course, even though this world is real now, they did just fine without it. In the game, the guys were building a frame and erecting a house on a 1-2 punch, and it was pretty impressive. However, just watching everyone just idly work was kind of underwhelming. Pein felt bad. Standing up from his chair, he decided that this was no longer a game, and that he would try it too. Running up to the boys, he decided that this time they could use his help too, but the girls immediately turned him down. Lala exclaimed that Mr. Pein could not be involved in such small errands. Eri was in complete agreement with her, and the boy didn't understand how that was so. Lala tilted her head back and covered her face with her hand. She could understand how the master was kind, and he always tried to understand their feelings. But it was okay, because working for him, they were filled with boundless happiness. They didn't care how difficult the task was. So Eri and Lala asked Pein to sit down and rest, pointing to a chair. Pein was uncomfortable, but had to agree. The girls were going over the building plan, Gus was hammering nails, and Pachai and Nobo were hauling large boards. Pein was thinking about monster hunting and building. It appeared that unlike monster hunting, construction was considered a small errand. He thought it was probably because he was constantly doing it during the game. It had already gotten dark outside, and their big house was already finished. Pepin's group managed to do the whole house in a whole day. There were vegetable gardens, a well, and a warehouse. The guy was just shocked. Despite everyone having great skills in building structures, they finished so quickly. The Harpy asked the Lord what should they do next in that case. The guy replied that it was already quite late and suggested that they continue tomorrow. Yawning, Eri thought about the fact that they would need to start developing the base from tomorrow. Pein said that they would need to start looking for new subordinates. Lala thought about it and noticed that it was quite a hassle. Also, their base level was quite low. In addition, according to Gloria Septim's rules, only members of the 7 luckless races could join them. Pein couldn't understand what Eri meant when she said that only members of the 7 luckless races could join. Even after becoming a reality, the tie to the races remained. Pein had to remove this restriction for the sake of their future. Pein wanted to talk about this rule. Gus mentioned what the king was able to do for them, the rejected ones. And the least they could do was stick to the rules. Pachai also didn't want anyone around but their races. Nobo agreed and said it would take a long time, but there was nothing they could do about it. Pein was simply shocked. What he had done before was for the sake of increasing the difficulty of the game, but now it was considered his lifelong dream. He didn't understand what these guys were even thinking. The state wasn't there anymore, after all, and now was not the time to be faithful to the rules. While Pein was fidgeting on the sidelines, Lala called out to him. But at the same time, he couldn't tell them that he was now willing to be friends with all races. After all, if they started to rebel, nothing good would end. Finally, Pein exclaimed that it didn't matter how long it took them because Gloria Septim is a country for 7 luckless races. Pein had made up his mind, and the whole group was happy about the decision. Now this big house was for them, and they continued to unite the 7 luckless races. First, they needed to raise the level of the base. They still had plenty of work to do, and the hero asked the boys not to relax. In general terms, Gus decided to tell what their plan looked like. The current base, that is, their settlement, was on the 1st level. To reach the 2nd level, they needed to build some buildings. A laboratory and a few dozen dwellings were needed. A well and similar structures had to be built. It was also necessary to reach a number of 50 inhabitants. Additional conditions were also here. One needed to learn more than 6 types of magic, mastery of architecture and gardening above the 7th level, and the availability of certain food in stock. In terms of construction, they only slipped in the number of houses. Lala was angry that it was Gus who was explaining everything for Mr. Pein. Developing architecture and gardening, as well as finding new partners, was paramount right now. Pein would want Eri to do the research, and Eri accepted the order from the Lord. The hero noticed that Eri looked rather strange, but Gus replied that she had been like that since morning. Pein also suggested that the others assign their roles. There would be those who would go with him to find new subordinates, and those who would stay at the base for construction and security. He thought they should split into 2 groups. Lala stated that in that case, she wouldn't mind being Mr. Pepin's companion. Fasia also wanted to go with Mr. Pein, to which he agreed. Pachai and Nobo felt uncomfortable being around a disappointed Lala. The elfess really hoped that there was another place, and the hero decided to ask who would like to go with him like this. All 3 boys immediately turned their backs on Pein. Nobo decided to better take care of the housing issue, and Pachai decided to guard their base. Gus headed after them. Pein asked Lala if she wanted to join them, and the girl of course said yes. Fasia noticed a crowd heading in their direction, and everyone looked back. They were armed men that looked quite strong. The boy thought they were bandits and thought they would have no trouble chasing them away. When they approached the heroes, the boy asked them to wait. Pein was terrified, realizing that they were all humans, not monsters. He didn't know if he would be able to kill a human. He had killed opponents many times in the game, but it was completely different in reality. He remembered the battle with the Cyclops, and decided that there was nothing wrong with it, because he had already felt the same thing in the battle with the monster. One of the men with an eye patch approached the boys, saying that they were new here. His friends shouted that they were just trash races who had decided to build their own settlement. The bandit approached Pein and said that he usually sold his kind into slavery. Deciding to make an exception, he offered to pay him 1,000 gold weekly. It seemed like a good deal to him. Pein asked them to get the hell out of here, as he didn't want to waste his time on them. The man with the eye patch laughed and asked if the others had seen it. His friend yelled that the trash had decided to act arrogant, but said he'd give the guy another chance. He put a condition on the hero by putting a sword to him. Either he pays him 1,000 gold every week or he dies. The hero Pein also decided to meet them and give them another chance. The bandit laughed and couldn't understand what the guy was talking about. He swung his sword at the hero and shouted that he would chop him into pieces, as Pein wished. Without moving, Pein decided to return the favor, and Gus delivered a slashing blow to the brigand that sent him flying backwards. Gus noticed that apparently the bandit didn't even have time to speak. All the bandits were confused, not realizing what had just happened. Gus thought he had killed him too quickly, but the hero replied that he himself did not want to retreat for good, and they had nothing more to talk to him about. Pein cast an intimidating glance at the brigands and suggested that they fight back. Pachai, Nobo, and Fasia immediately rushed into battle. Their battle began, and Fasia let her destructive blades loose on one of the opponents. Nobo meanwhile used his magic on several brigands at once, and Pachai chopped their heads off with his huge sword. According to one of the brigands, these little brats were very strong despite their worthless race. The other, however, was watching the fight and could not understand what was going on here. They spotted an unarmed Lala, who didn't look so strong from the back. They decided they were going to kill her. They came at her from behind and shouted that she should have been more careful, calling her long-eared. But the girl didn't even move as they were simultaneously pierced by a slashing blow. The brigands couldn't understand how it happened and noticed a magic circle on the ground. She summoned a saber with the help of this magic circle, which they noticed late. No matter how luckless races they were, being able to use basic magic was something even they could do. Lala gripped the saber in her hands and smiled at her enemies. Just because the enemy was unarmed, they already considered her inattentive. At once, many brigands pounced on the elf, shouting that she would do nothing to them with just her wretched saber. The girl made a lot of dance moves at high speed, and cut absolutely all the opponents without using much effort. Lola thought they were only a group of fools who thought they could point their blade towards Mr. Pein. Meanwhile, the hero was watching all of this from the side. A terrifying spectacle was currently taking place in front of him, yet he felt completely calm. Perhaps it was the influence of cold-blooded skill. In the game of magic and sword, there was a so-called cold-blooded skill, and the higher it was, the easier it was for him to fight. When this skill was quite low, and he was fighting a large number of enemies, if any of them died, he would receive an abnormal status and could not move for a while, after which he would flee away from the enemy against his will. However, Pepin's cold-blooded skill was of the maximum 50th level. After killing even 300 enemies, he couldn't obtain any abnormal status. He thought that because of this skill, he could also analyze calmly. Pein hoped that he would be able to maintain this composure in other similar situations. While he was thinking about it, a man with an eye patch came to his attention. He couldn't understand how such a trash race could be so strong, and wondered who they were. Unintentionally, he stepped on a small pebble, which made the hero hear him behind him. The man fell to the ground in horror at the sight of Pein drawing his sword. The subordinates did not spare all their strength, and the general just stood behind and looked at it all. Pein put his sword to the rabbinic and asked if he had any parting words. The robber in desperation asked him to wait and pleaded for help, but it was too late. So they had an unexpected obstacle, but they needed to get back to their original plan. Pein told Lala and Fasia that they would go with him to search for the wards, and Fasia was delighted. Nobo, Gus, and Pachai asked Mr. Pein to take care of himself, and the hero promised them that he would. Fasia ran up to Lala and Pein, asking where they were going. Lala answered her that they were going to the village of Ashirs. As far as the hero remembered, there was an elven village north of here at the foot of the mountain. He wanted to look there for volunteers willing to relocate. Fasia hoped they wouldn't be as horrible as Lala. Lala was shocked, not understanding why she was horrible. Fasia admitted to her that when it came to Mr. Pein, it was better not to be around her. Even Pein admitted that this was true. A few minutes before the arrival of Mr. Pein and his companions, Something happened in the village of Ashiers. There was shouting, followed by a command to sit in silence. It appeared that the elves had been captured. One of the men asked his comrade if they had cleared the entire village, and his partner told him that they had grabbed everything they could find. Fasia was exhausted and said that she could not go any further, for she was very hungry. Lala told her that she had eaten a whole roast wild boar for lunch. Besides, they would soon reach the village and asked her to be patient. Fasia was almost in tears talking about how bad she felt, and the hero asked her to be patient a little longer. Lala looked around and was sure the village was somewhere around here. Looking around more closely, she spotted the entrance to the village in the distance and immediately rushed there. The girls were glad they had finally made it and ran to the gate. Pein smiled, even though they couldn't get here until after midnight. Fasia decided to greet the people in the village of Ashiers and wished them a good evening. As they came closer, the heroes noticed a frightening sight before them. Everything was destroyed, and one of the people asked if they had captured all the ears. The lizard-shaped beast thought he saw someone else in the neighboring house. The three-eyed brigand told him to knock it off, as the corpses made it uncomfortable for them to walk, and suggested they shift a bit. Nudging one of the elves with his foot, the man demanded that they move. Lala was shocked at the way they were treating the elves from the village. She recognized their subordinates. It was their abbreviation for what stood for the Black Company. In the world of magic and sword, they were involved in slave trade, selling drugs and illegal magic books, murder, robbery, and kidnapping. It was the largest criminal gang in the world. Most likely, they were going to sell the captured elves into slavery. Once the hero himself was a member of their group and was able to achieve considerable success. Acting cruelly and unfairly, he focused on the fact that it was just a game, although even so he felt bad. He knew that getting involved with these guys was signing his own death warrant. It looked like they didn't need to take any action for now, since their base hadn't even become a village yet. He was sad that they wouldn't be able to make these elves their subordinates, but there was nothing they could do about it. Pein decided that they needed to avoid taking unnecessary risks, but Lala didn't think so, and ordered them to stop immediately. She shouted that before them stood the great Lord Pein, who would never turn a blind eye to the violence inflicted on 7 luckless races, including the elves. Pein didn't want this to happen, but Fasia also shouted to the brigands and supported Lala. She was just horrified at what they had done to this village. For now, they couldn't even eat in it. The hero noticed that Fasia had other goals in mind altogether. The brigands didn't realize what kind of naughty people were yelling at them, having considered an elf, a harpy, and a dwarf in the group. Pein didn't want them to notice them, but it happened nonetheless. The lizard laughed, asking if this dwarf was really a hero. The other had never heard of a hero with such a laughable name. Lala said that this was just unprecedented rudeness, and demanded that they take back their words, or they would pay for them. The three-eyed masked man laughed and offered her a taste. There was no way for them to avoid this battle anymore, and Pein exhaled tiredly. If they dealt with them and left no witnesses, everything should have been fine. Pein stepped forward of the girls and suggested that Fasia and Lala destroy them and not let any of them escape. Fasia and Lala accepted the order and prepared for battle. Meanwhile, the hero group space was quiet. Sitting at the table in the house, the guys were wondering what race their new subordinates would be. Pachai thought that they needed to start by gathering an army capable of defending the future state. So about 100 kobolds would solve that problem. Nobo sipped from his mug and remarked that Pachai had overreacted to the 100 kobolds. He thought that the guards needed those who could use not only strength, but also brains. Pachai grabbed his sword, not understanding what Nobo meant. Gus asked Iri her opinion, thinking about the fact that she ate a lot. Iri chewed her food and replied that the closest village to their base was Ashiers village. Everyone looked at each other and decided that in that case, the elves would come. There was a tense silence, and only Nobo broke it by sipping from his glass. They all hoped that the elves would not be as terrifying as Lala. Somewhere in the village, meanwhile, endless screams rang out. Looking at the terrifying characters, the brigands could not understand who they were. It was as if they were not of the luckless races. Their absolute strength towered over the bodies of their enemies. They were true monsters. Pein thought that he could assign this couple to deal with the remnants. Meanwhile, he would take care of rescuing the elves. The rest of the gang watched the captives, and one of them asked his partner if everyone was here. The rhinoceros-like beast agreed with him, but then something caught his attention. There was some sort of commotion from the side of the entrance, and it seemed to the brigand that someone's silhouette was peering through there. Right in front of them, they spotted a guy who was a dwarf. Pein had finally found them. The bandits blocked his path with their swords and ordered him to stand still. They couldn't understand what such a little guy was doing here. Paying no attention to them, the lad drew his sword and immediately cut through the enemies, asking the elves if they were all right. The elven didn't know what to answer the hero, but Pein said he would explain everything to them later. First, the ropes had to be untied. Thinking that they were very tight, another enemy was quietly approaching him from behind. Calling him an asshole, the brigand swung his sword at Pein. The elven woman yelled for the hero to be more careful, but he asked her not to worry about it. While the brigand was distracted by the hero, he was attacked from behind by two girls. He turned around before he could even spot them. Fasia and Lala struck the attacker at the same time, and he fell to the ground. The hero thanked the girls for their help. Lala was pleased with herself, and replied that they had destroyed all of Mr. Pepin's enemies. Fasia immediately became gloomy, feeling wildly hungry. The captive looked at Lala in surprise that she was just like them. In that case, the guy suggested that they split up and unleash all the elves. When all the prisoners were released, hungry Fasia was finally able to eat properly. She was so hungry that she ate with both hands, filling her mouth completely. Of course, food was a very important thing to her, but she didn't want the elves to waste so much food on them. But the elves didn't see it that way, for they had saved them. Lala motioned for the harpy to stop, noticing her speeding up. The elf couldn't imagine what could have happened to them, and thanked Pein from the bottom of her heart. The hero was confused and replied that it was fine. As long as he was alive, he couldn't let such horrible things happen to someone. After all, it goes without saying. The girl introduced herself as Lucy, and she was the head of the village of Ashirs. She asked the hero who he was. Before the guy could answer, he was interrupted by a female voice exclaiming that he was the savior of the 7 races. Lala, as usual, introduced the king of glorious Suptum and the greatest hero in the world. She asked him to love and pity him, but the hero thought he had too many titles. Lala told how they lost their country, but struggled to revive it with incredible talents. And as a first step, they came to this village to find new subordinates. In that case, it made sense to Lucy. Except this place was hard to even call it a village. Lucy suggested that the heroes take all the people of Ashir's village under their command. Pein, Fasia, and Lala were just shocked at such a suggestion. Guy decided to clarify if she was sure she was talking about all the people in the village, and Lucy agreed with him. He had thought about a couple or 3 people, but not all of them. The game had never suggested to him to subdue so many inhabitants. There were about 60 elves in Ashir's village, and with that many, their settlement would pump up to village level and move up a level. Except Lucy thought that they might be a nuisance to them. But the hero said that wasn't the case. This place was a bit far from their current base. 2 villages would be quite difficult to maintain, so they would have to leave Ashir's. Pein asked the elves if they were prepared for such a thing. Lucy sadly replied that it didn't matter now. This village was in such a place that it was hard to find them. That's why they were able to avoid attacks for so long. But the other elves and also the luckless races were attacked intensely and enslaved one by one. Lala and Fasia became furious, cursing the bandit group. The hero agreed that they were nasty guys. No one could help them if the other races despised them and attacked them unfairly. Even if they stayed here, the faction would return again and everything would come to an end. Lucy asked Lala about the fact that Pein was the savior of the 7 races, and even at first she didn't believe the fact that he helped weak races like them. But Lala replied that he did, and that Mr. Pein was a great man. He was the only hope for them, rejected by all. The people of the elves were simply ecstatic and a smile appeared on their faces. They looked at the hero saying that it was just awesome and that he was so wonderful. They had the same reaction as Lala, and Pein thought that all the elves were just like her. Lala also wanted to clarify that now they are not the 7 luckless races. They are Gloria Septim, the land of the 7 first-class races. Lucy was simply delighted by the name Gloria and the first-class races, and her eyes sparkled. Kneeling down, the girl wished to address Mr. Pein and asked him again as the head of the village. All the villagers bowed in her wake, and she asked to take them all under her leadership. All the villagers were happy with this decision and looked at Pein with a smile. He had never imagined that finding subordinates would go so well the first time. At this rate, his country would be rebuilt in no time. He would be able to do it even faster than when he played the game. Pein happily declared that now, as of today, they were all members of Gloria Septim and his subordinates. Thus, Pein now had 62 elves at his disposal, which asked Pein to go ahead. Thus 2 days passed, shortly before Pepin's return. Iri took a look at the super architecture, and also at the super research. Gus grimly pronounced that all they had to do was wait for the king, and that was it. Looking at the warehouse, no one could figure out who had gobbled up the supplies. Gus was horrified and didn't understand how a 2-week supply of food could be ground up in just 2 days. The king could have been back any minute, and here it was. Pachai, biting off a piece of meat, asked Gus to be calmer and not cause a panic. Iri also chewed and asked him to consider that this was a test of his calmness. Gus snatched the piece out of Pachai's hands and yelled that he should have used his head and not eaten the entire supply clean. Pachai decided to ask Iri if she knew of any spells or scientific tricks that could increase their food supply. Iri replied that it was neither magic nor tricks. Nobo came up to Gus and said that they had 2 or 3 more days before the king returned. Somehow they had to manage, but Gus asked him about his subordinates. Nobo felt that they didn't have to worry about that, because even if someone joined them, there would be plus or minus an insignificant 2 or 3 people at the current base level. Titan thought that the king would forgive him, but Lala would definitely be out of his mind. Usually situations like this are a collective responsibility, according to Iri. Pachai decided she was right, and Nobo asked her to be quiet. Suddenly, Pepin's voice came from behind him, announcing their return. Nobo was glad, remembering the ray here and the sun. Seeing Pepin's escorts, they were simply shocked. Fasia smiled and exhaled tiredly. She was glad that they had finally made it. Pein apologized for them being away for so long. Gus looked at the very insignificant 2 or 3 people in horror. They couldn't understand how this could have happened. After all, there were over 50 of them. The hero couldn't understand what they were so frightened about. Gus nervously said that it was because Pein had brought so many people. Pein replied to Gus that he had had great luck, and 62 elves from the village of Ashirs had agreed to join them. Nobo was surprised and praised Mr. Pein for his excellent work. Gus bewilderedly greeted the new residents. Lala assumed that something had happened in their absence, and Gus looked away and said that was not the case. The hero was approached by Eri, who brought a pile of books. She said that all the research she had asked for was in here, and that it had been a success. The hero praised Eri for a great job, which made Gus angry. Then suddenly appeared Pachai, which called his majesty. He reported to the hero that during his absence the villains did not show up. However, he was still ready to defend their country at the cost of his life. These thoughts had not left him during all this time. Iri replied that he said well, and Pachai was in agreement with her. Gus cursed them, for they had only good news. Gus looked up at Nobo and decided that he would have to apologize to him. But Nobo turned to Mr. Pein and said he would appreciate it if someone would help him with the buildings. The hero remembered this and thought it would be a good thing, because Nobo was probably already on his feet. Gus looked at Nobo with anger, unable to find the words. A happy Fasia immediately ran to the warehouse, wanting to eat, and Gus immediately got a shiver. He asked her to stop and pray for a start, but the harpy only wanted a snack to begin with. Gus looked for various reasons and asked to see how dirty she was now. Gus stepped back as a heavy chest fell at his feet. The hero replied to the group that they were now a level higher, and their village was now a real village. So the system was the same as in the game. Fasia happily sat down on the chest, scaring Gus. In this treasure chest, they could find the reconstructions of the residences. The main residence is the very first construction. By renovating this residence, They could upgrade it to the house of the village headman in the village or the house of the city headman in the city. If the dwelling is upgraded to a mansion, travelers will start to show more interest, including potential subordinates. And then Gloria Septim would regain her former glory. Thinking about it, the hero wishes it would happen sooner. Lala suggested that the others celebrate new friends and the upgrade of the settlement. Everyone was happy, but Pepperin noticed that Gus was nervous for some reason. The hero asked Lala and Fasia to guide the elves to their lodgings, for the 2 days of travel had worn them out. He decided that they would postpone the feast until later. The girls certainly listened to him and immediately led the elves behind them. Gus breathed out a sigh of relief and Pepperin came up to him and asked what was wrong. Gus didn't know how to answer him honestly. When he showed the warehouse to the hero and apologized for it, Pepperin was just shocked that they had no food at all. Iri and Pachai took it out on Gus and told him he shouldn't have hoarded so much. Gus was furious, thinking they were messing with him. But the hero asked them to calm down, and what's done is done. But they still have to go looking for food, or there won't be enough for everyone. All three of them bowed to the hero and asked them not to tell Lala about it. Pepperin was shocked that they were more afraid of Lala than they were of their master. Pepperin asked them if he could send them out for food now, and the boys of course agreed. Gus was furious with Fasia and Iria, for they were real gluttons, and you couldn't tell from them. But the problem would only become a problem if they didn't solve it in time. The hero headed for the village, thinking that they would make it through. But Pepperin himself had completely forgotten something. He had forgotten about those who should immediately appear to them after hearing about it. An army, led by a horseman, appeared on the horizon that they had learned that Gloria Septim had become a village. It had been about a month since the hero had found himself in the world of sword and magic. The girls wished him good morning, and Pepperin returned the favor. Their base level went up, and his subordinates adored the hero for being a good king. Their shack was now a first-class dwelling. In the game, he was over the moon when he got his first real home. There was much to do, though, and Pepperin lay down under a tree and closed his eyes. Sometimes you needed to be alone with yourself and reflect. It was hard to relax when there were always people milling around. And even the king sometimes needed to be alone. Before he could think about it, he was immediately called. The villagers finally found the king and notified him that something strange was going on at the border of the village and called him there. Yawning tiredly, the hero decided that it was bandits again. It would be necessary to build a wall as soon as possible, otherwise there would be no peace from them. The guy heard voices that demanded to call here the chief and asked where he was. The hero could not understand what it was. Going to the voice, Pepperin with sleepy eyes said that he arrived, but what he saw repelled him all sleepiness and fatigue. The tall man and Lats met Pachai and Lala with stern looks. Lala assumed they were from the Spaulding family and asked what they needed from Mr. Pepperin. Pachai smiled and told his guest that he was only pretending to be human. The soldier behind them was furious and asked how dare they treat the commander-in-chief like that. But the commander shouted that he didn't care. He was the commander of the order in the service of the Spaulding family, Lou Plasdar. He asked the heroes if they were aware of whose land they were now on. He stated that it was the property of Marotta Spaulding, the head of the family. They could not build a village here, so Lou ordered them to get out of here immediately. The hero had completely forgotten about them, but it was exactly as the commander-in-chief said. Since they were here, it was probably about the taxes. As long as they were a settlement, they didn't care much about it. But as soon as they upgraded to a village, it stirred up their discontent. They wanted them to pay taxes for this land, the plain of Talsheim, owned by the Spaulding family of the Aleph Azerade Empire. If they refused to pay them, war would break out and a huge army would be sent against them. Then they'll be dead for sure. Pepperin knew that the Spaulding family were conscientious taxpayers, and it would be good to follow their example. In the game, the tax was 5% of the annual parish. But before he could say anything back, Lala yelled out that they didn't care about the Spaulding family, because they were from the unshakable kingdom of Gloria Septim. And if they wanted to get rid of them, they would have to use force on them. At this statement, the hero was simply horrified. This was what he feared the most, and he didn't understand why they kept escalating the situation. They needed to keep developing the village, or else the situation could only get more complicated. The hero ordered Pachai and Lala to stop. After introducing himself to Lu, he said that he was the headman of this village, apologizing for being late. The general didn't realize at first whether the dwarf in front of him was a dwarf or a child, but the hero replied that he was a dwarf. The general looked at the rest of the villagers. At first glance, the village was full of elves, but if you looked closely, you could see giants, harpies, kobolds, demons, and about 70 other creatures. The general didn't understand how they managed to gather so many vile creatures together. Pachai became furious, but Pepperin asked him to calm down. The hero apologized to Lu and asked what they wanted them to do. As he had said before, these lands belonged to the Spaulding family and they had to get out of here. The hero asked him to wait, as he would not want to hear such a demand from him, and offered to negotiate. The general hesitated, and the hero said that he had one proposal for them. This land was originally vacant, and it would be a good idea to create a village here for the benefit of the Spaulding family. The general asked if they were willing to swear allegiance to the family, but that was exactly what the Pepperin meant. The general thought and smiled as he looked at Pepperin. He ordered the soldier to bring a scroll, and the soldier immediately listened to him, holding out the parchment. General Lu announced the start of negotiations, but Pepperin asked him to wait. He suggested that they go to his residence, for the matter was important and they should make themselves comfortable and discuss everything quietly. The general agreed and took 2 men, ordering the others to stay where they were. The hero asked the rest of the villagers to wait here as well, but Lala wanted to go with him, as there were 2 others with the general. Pepperin did not hesitate to immediately refuse her. While they would negotiate, no one was to come near the residence. Pepperin asked that this be conveyed to all absentees. Looking at Lala, he thanked her, which made the girl's eyes sparkle. She gladly accepted his request. The hero mentally exhaled, because they should not have been present at a negotiation where he was in an obviously losing position. He didn't want to lose the loyalty of his group. When the heroes arrived at the residence, the general offered to start negotiations in that case, though the only thing they had left to discuss was the tax rate. Pepperin would like to think that this is still a game. Of all the crops harvested in this village, 40% was to be paid to the Spaulding family. Then they would not attack them or drive them out of the village. At first, not understanding anything, the boy agreed, but then he asked to wait. Pepperin was horrified after realizing these figures. 40% was a lot, and he didn't understand where the generosity of the tax collectors was. Pepperin asked to lower the tax even a little, but according to the general, their village was full of inferior races, which is useless in war. It appeared that they could only be used for agriculture. Pepperin was not happy with his words, all because they were weaklings. Their affairs were not good at all. The hero wanted to tell them that not long ago they had just been attacked by bandits, and although they were weak, they could fight them. But the general did not think so, and the minnows were still minnows to him. He replied that their race would never be useful in battle. The hero began to lose his temper and gritted his teeth. He thought that the general was making a big deal out of himself and calling them minnows. He wanted to just destroy and attack them, showing his strength. But the guy came to his senses and turned away from that idea. It reminded him of Lala's idea. Meanwhile, the elven girl sneezed, and Iri thought she was sick. It would be nice for a hero to have some kind of track record to prove it to the general. Pepperin replied to Lu that if there was some unresolved issue in Spaulding territory, they would help them deal with it. And if they resolved the issue, they would lower their tax rate. The general wondered what the problem might be. The main problem was that the WVS was a direct threat to the security of their territory. They probably already had a safe haven somewhere nearby, but it was unlikely, in Lu's opinion, that they could solve this problem. Pepperin offered to lower their rate if they discovered the location of their Air Force base and destroyed them. The general laughed. He didn't understand why he would offer something they couldn't do. The hero asked for the rate to be lowered to 10%, which shocked the general. If they destroyed their hideouts, they would have to reduce the rate to 10%. Also, if they did this, they would be in open conflict with the Air Force. It was a risk they were willing to take, so they deserved a kickback. Pepperin asked the general for his opinion, and Lu smiled. He was interested in all of this and accepted the hero's offer. Pein was happy and decided to make sure of it again, but that the general answered positively. He gave them a deadline of a month, and if they failed, their tax rate would increase to 50%, which the hero was simply shocked by. If you act at half strength and just provoke their anger, they will start making more raids. And if they asked the weaker race to deal with them, they were risking much more than them. In that case, the general decided to ask again if they were confident in their strength. If not, a tax rate of 40% would suit them. The hero asked him to wait and asked if they could help them with something else. But according to the general, they didn't have so many problems that they could lower the tax rate. The boy didn't know what he should do. He thought that if he could solve some other problems that didn't involve the Air Force, he could get the tax rate lowered. If they set a deadline, they had no choice but to act. But if they do succeed, they will pay the low rate. Unfortunately, no matter what their rate was, it still wouldn't be easy to destroy the VVS asylum. The general waited for a reply from Pein, and the guy asked for a minute, promising to reply later after he got back. But the general was against it, and asked to answer him here and now. Pein sighed heavily. Taking the agreement paper, he accepted their terms. Leaving, the army wished them good luck in developing their village and paying their taxes. They eagerly awaited their report on how things would go with the VVS base. Collapsing on the bed, the hero had no idea how to explain this to everyone. All this just to reduce the tax from 40% to 10%. In Pein's opinion, they would think he was a crazy asshole and his reputation would be over. The elves of Arches had been attacked by the VVS before, so it was entirely possible that they would want revenge on them. Still, it seemed like coercion. But it could have been a mission to free the 7 races from the oppression of the VVS. Hero and Lala exhaled heavily at the same time. Eri sat next to Lala and asked her what happened. Lala replied that it was nothing, and in that case, Eri was about to leave when suddenly the elfess grabbed her by the tail. Eri turned around and asked again, but in Lala's opinion, she already knew everything. She wanted to become more useful, but Eri thought she was fine even now. Lala wasn't satisfied with that answer. She kept saying that it was all wrong, and thought that it was not enough and not normal at all. Earlier, after meeting the Spaulding family, she had tried to stay with the gentleman, but he had asked her to leave him for a while. She understood that Mr. Pein was in some kind of trouble, and she really wanted to help him. She felt terribly ashamed and disappointed, but Eri didn't think anything more was expected of her. It wasn't about her. It was just that there was always someone around Pein. Eri was sure that he just wanted to be alone sometimes to think. In that case, there was no need to be so tense. If he needed help, the Lord would probably ask her for help. Lala was glad at Eri's words. She shook hands with Eri and thanked her, telling her that she would stop whining and do her best. Eri waved goodbye to Lala and thought she could use a little more restraint. Running back to the village, Lala thought of the hero and mentally promised to continue serving him. Suddenly, Lala was called by Lucy, and the girl thought something was wrong. Lucy replied that it was bad, saying something about her sister. After a little breathing, she was able to tell Lala that her little sister had been kidnapped by the Air Force. Lucy didn't know what to do, and decided that she should report everything to Mr. Pein. But Lala asked her to calm down, and the king was busy now. She asked Lucy to let her tell the Lord personally. Lucy told that this morning Reese and his friends went to play in the forest. As they were walking along the forest, they decided that they had gone too far away and it could be dangerous. But Reese replied that it was okay, because their sister had given them permission. The elf who was with her was afraid of the monsters that might be here. But Reese replied that there were no strong monsters in this forest, so she thought it was safe. She heard that colored rabbits lived here, which was a very rare species. She thought that Pein herself would probably be happy if they brought one home to him. Peeking out from behind a bush, the girl asked them to look ahead. Right in front of them sat that very cute rabbit. The children decided that he was too cute and they needed to catch him. Reese replied that she would catch it herself. Crouching down in front of the rabbit, she called it to her. The rabbit noticed the girl and approached her, sniffing her hand, and Reese told him not to be afraid. Taking the rabbit in his arms, he rubbed his nose on her cheek and Reese laughed, afraid of the tickle. Apparently, they were able to make friends with him. The other children were just thrilled and would also like to hug him. Noticing another one nearby, Reese looked around. But they were unlucky enough to stumble upon a gang of VWs. The leader with an eye patch right in front of them crushed a rabbit and asked the little elves what are they doing here. The kids were terrified, not realizing where the VVS group had come from. One of the bandits decided that such youngsters would make excellent slaves. The other agreed with him, for there was much to teach them. Reese exclaimed that she would deal with them and ordered the others to go back to the village and tell the ruler and the others. But the children were against it and knew very well that she couldn't do it alone. The girl turned to them and shouted for them to run, and they listened to her. The children promised to call for help. One of the group ordered the others not to let them get away, and the girl took her knife in her trembling hands. The bandit laughed and told her not to be afraid, for the place where they would go with her he called a true paradise. From this place Reese was kidnapped. All that was left on the ground was her knife. Lala clarified if it was the VVS, but the children were sure of it. They were wearing the same bandans as the ones that had attacked the Ashirs. Nobu was afraid that if that was the case, their business was bad. They would surely sell her into slavery or work her to death. Lucy was just horrified at such words and begged Lala to save her sister. Lala of course agreed and said they were off to rescue Reese. But Pachai asked them to wait because they needed to tell Pepperin about their plans. Lala was sure that he would support them, but Gus wasn't so sure about that either. Mr. Pepperin had once said that the VVS wasn't the most pleasant company. It was one thing to fight slave owners in their own territory, and quite another to barge into their lair. He decided to see what Mr. Pepperin had to say about it. Lucy couldn't imagine what would happen to Reese in such a case. Gus was sure that Mr. Pepperin would be happy to help them anyway. Lala agreed, but it was silly to even speculate what the Lord was thinking. In any case, Gus thought they should go back to the village and ask for help, and everyone was in agreement with him. Taking Reese's knife in her hand, Lucy cried and thought of Mr. Pepperin. She thought also of her sister and hoped for the best. Pepperin picked up a pencil and offered to rescue their lesser brothers from Gloria Septim and defeat the VVS. Hideout. As it turned out, he was preparing the plan in his room with papers scattered everywhere. He decided that this would not do, because it turned out a little crooked. Throwing out another piece of paper, the hero decided that they were going to smash their capistas, or rather secret hideouts. Swearing, Pepperin couldn't think of anything. He thought to himself that there must be something pathos. He would like someone word that could make him sound like Lou. He decided that he should have said simply that they would destroy the WW shelter. He imagined himself as Lala asking why they would do that. Playing his part again, he said there was no reason, but they would do it anyway. While Pepperin was acting out his scenes, he heard some noise outside. Looking out the window, he decided to see why it was so noisy outside. He was shocked to see a whole crowd of residents under his house. Lala turned to Mr. Pepperin and was well aware that he was busy, and yet she wanted to talk to him about something. The hero immediately thought of what they had learned about the tax stack and was horrified. Otherwise, he didn't understand why they would gather here for any kind of talk. He could hear the anger in their voices, and he felt uneasy. He decided that in that case, he didn't care about being squeamish. He also decided to take advantage of royal privileges and would order them to go and destroy the VVS hideout or whatever they had there. They would then commandeer 10% of the tax rate. Going out to the crowd, he said that he was Pepperin, king of Gloria Septim, and since he said so, he would do it. The crowd looked questioningly at the hero. Lala wanted to tell the Lord everything, but Pepperin asked everyone to listen. He shouted that Gloria Septim would invade the VVS copies, for they themselves understood why and why they needed to. He raised his hands in the air and said that they would stand up for their future and ordered everyone to prepare for war. There was an awkward silence and Pepperin thought they might not like it, but was sure they would regret nothing. Lucy tearfully thought that Pepperin himself already knew about everything. Not realizing what was going on, the boy froze in place. Lucy went over to him and grabbed his hands. She thanked him twice from the bottom of her heart. The crowd shouted that Pepperin was their king and savior, and asked him to go forward. Lala told Pepperin that he was right, and that they would immediately start preparing for war. They had to rescue the kidnapped Reese, and the hero only found out about it now. Reese was the sister of Lucy, the former head of the Ashiers. He remembered her as an all-time friendly elf. There had even been times when they had played with her together. In the hero's opinion, the VVS wanted to kill Reese in retaliation for what happened in the village of Ashiers. They took care of all the bodies, and they would never know that they did it. But Pein could tell for sure that it was all very apropos. He thought that this way he wouldn't have to explain anything to them, and his popularity would only increase. Pein decided that they would save Reese and destroy the Air Force base. The hero shouted to everyone that it was time to make a plan. He asked Lala and the others to go to their residence. In the Spalding territory of the Aleph Azerid Empire, there was one place. Reese was lying unconscious on the floor and was just beginning to regain consciousness. As she opened her eyes and raised herself up, she felt that her whole body was aching. She remembered that earlier she had been beaten by those guys from the Air Force. Being behind bars, the girl did not realize where she was. Suddenly, she heard a voice behind her that greeted the new girl, who finally woke up. The dark silhouette noticed that it was an elf again, and was upset that this time they didn't bring a better race. Reese asked the mysterious man where they were, and the voice replied that they were in the VVS shelter. He assumed that the girl had also been kidnapped. Reese confirmed his words, and told him that her village had been attacked and she had been dragged here. Silhouette rose to his feet, replying that everyone who was here was already dead. The VVS weren't even given a break, and forced them to work them to the ground. Once here one could say goodbye to the outside world. The girl approached the frightened Reese and welcomed her to hell. Despair immediately entered Reese's heart. Reese told the prisoner that she needed to get out of here, which made the girl laugh. She didn't understand how Reese could be so stupid as to want to get out, and asked her to pay attention to her chain, which was on her legs for a reason. Reese decided to ask the girl who she was, but the girl asked her to say her name first before asking someone else's. The elven girl grudgingly said her name to Reese, and in response, the girl introduced herself with the name Pana. Pana was of the inferior race of dwarves. Pana sat down on a rock, deciding that Reese needed to calm down first, for soon she was going to have to start working so hard that she would have no energy or time left to suffer. Reese was shocked and asked Pana what they were making her do. As it turned out, they were in a mine. The VVS were capturing their people and forcing them to work for free. She asked if Reese knew about the blasting rock, but the girl had no idea. It was a stone that explodes when highly irritated, and it was often used for weapons. It was listed as a dangerous mineral, so only a few people at the Spalding were allowed to mine it, but the VVS didn't care about that. Slaves are easily replaceable, and here they were killed by an explosion or died from overworking. They still managed to be a bit of a friend before they died, though. Now it was necessary to summarize all of the above. The hero was discussing a plan with his group. He wanted Fasia and Pachai to take over the guards at the entrance. They needed to get to the alarm system and disable it if they could. Pachai exclaimed that he would do his best and take all the hard work on himself. They were discussing the north entrance to the VVS shelter where their group would be heading. When the guards inside the shelter are down, Gus, Gala, and Eri will have to sneak in through the east entrance. They will rescue Reese and destroy the hideout, and everyone was in agreement with Mr. Pein. Nobo and the elves were to defend the base and stay. Nobo was sorry they couldn't go with them, but promised to do his best to take care of their home. Gus apologized to the Lord and had something he wanted to ask. The main goal of their mission was Reese. He didn't understand why they couldn't just leave the shelter after the mission was accomplished without destroying it. Pein pretended not to understand what Gus was talking about, but Lala was furious. To her, these were the monsters that had destroyed their village. They couldn't just take Reese away and forget about it all. This was a war, and if you were going to fight them, you had to be thorough. Gus decided not to argue with her, and he knew it. He was just curious. Looking at the heroes, Pein mentally apologized to Gus, because if it wasn't for the tax rates, he would have sided with him. Lala, meanwhile, raised Gus' hand and exclaimed that they would tear down the VVS shelter. In that case, if everyone was ready, it was safe to begin. The dungeon doors opened, and Reese was told it was time to get to work. The man knocked her down and the girl fell. He ordered her to move quickly and get up. Ordering her forward, Reese thought about the fact that there were only weak races here, and they had all been kidnapped. Looking around, the girl failed to spot Panu, and the man asked to be let through. One of the men did not understand why the girl was hatching and ordered her to work. But Reese replied that she didn't know what to do. It was the leader of the group, Purst. Since she was new, she had to look at the others and learn from them. Purst also said that if she made a mistake, she would die. The girl puffed up her cheeks and thought, why not pay more attention to her learning in that case? Looking at the others, she didn't understand. From the looks of it, she was supposed to look for the light red areas on the rocks. But it wasn't clear which parts were to be hit, the dark parts or vice versa. Either way, she had to give it a try. Taking the pickaxe in hand, she thought she should avoid the light red areas. No sooner had she gotten to work than there was an explosion from behind her. Reese turned around and saw the torn body of a slave in front of her. The gang member ordered them not to wrap the body, because there was no point in doing so. They decided to just feed the body to the monsters that were outside. Reese's tears flowed. It was better to die from overwork, but death from the bomb was unavoidable. The girl lost her temper and asked the people what was wrong with them. Purst heard and turned to her. Reese asked if they knew what life was. She didn't understand how a living being could be treated like garbage. Purst answered her that they were just tools and instruments, simple as that. They couldn't even be sold, and she was nothing more than a waste product. Purst thought they were unworthy of life and ordered her back to work. Reese thought this was rude and shouted that they were not tools. They weren't born to be used by scum like them. Feather reached out his hand to Reese's head, telling her that she was too brash. To him, she looked like she needed to be taught a lesson. But a female voice was heard from behind him, telling the Lord to stop. It was Pana, determined to lay everything out for Reese. Purst looked at the dwarf who was already sitting in his liver, but he had said himself that he liked it when the Intraments knew their stuff. She just wanted to give Reese a briefing. In that case, Purst left Reese to Pana and ordered her to explain to her what she was here for. Pana cheerfully thanked the leader. Grabbing the girl's hand, Pana led her behind her. Reese asked her friend what was going on here, and she ordered her to shut up and follow her. They reached a door, which she asked Reese to enter. Once inside, Reese saw a scary torture room with many implements. Reese was horrified, not realizing what kind of room was this. She asked Pana, what the hell was she doing? Pana decided that she would not let her out until she was sure that Reese was really just a working tool. The girl asked her not to be silly, assuring her that she was no tool. But she had two choices: stay here and let herself be tortured, or lie and recognize herself as a tool. Pana didn't really like torture, but if Reese had to be tortured, there was nothing that could be done here. There was no way Reese could allow herself to be called something like that, and Pana asked her to look on the bright side. Reese needed to be called out that there was nothing she could do to fix it. She couldn't defeat everyone and get them out of here. But Reese disagreed with Pana, because if they worked together, they probably could. But Pana didn't think so, and poked the girl in the nose with her finger. They could only obey and live on, or they could die right now. The girl bowed her head and agreed with her. After all, she was just a labor force for them, and she chose to recognize that. Pana smiled and said it was a reasonable choice. She happily announced to Mr. Purst that her lesson had been learned. The leader didn't like that the girls looked too cheerful. Pana replied that they were, and that Reese's nerves immediately gave out after she saw the camera. She decided to pretend to Reese that she supposedly begged her to forgive her and said that she would do her best. She also agreed to do whatever she was ordered to do. Purst laughed and thought that Reese was a coward. In that case, Purst decided to ask the girl who she was. Holding back, Reese fell to her knees and said that she was a tool. Purst thought this was excellent and ordered her to get to work quickly and do his bidding with dignity. While Reese was crying, Purst ordered Pana to follow him, and the girl, with a smile on her face, agreed. Once behind the bars again, Pana stretched briskly and sighed. She said she was tired, but the day had gone well, and she was satisfied. She also hoped that Reese had learned everything, which the elfess had to agree with. Pana placed the bread in front of Reese, and the girl looked at her in surprise. Purst gave Pana something, but she decided to share it with Reese. After all, they were neighbors. Reese didn't care. She didn't need anything from him. But Pana chewed it. She didn't care who gave it to her. It was just bread. Reese wondered why Pana had agreed to teach her, thinking she wanted to help. Pana laughed at her words, and the girl looked at her questioningly. Pana didn't understand why she would be doing this. She was just flirting with Purst, but Reese didn't know what she meant. It was Purst who ran the refuge, and if he liked it, he could get her out of her slavery in the mine at the refuge, and there was just cleaning and bringing food. And if you behaved really well, you could become an official member of the VVS. The elfess was shocked when she found out that Pana wanted to join the ranks of those monsters. Pana didn't understand what was wrong and asked Reese if she wanted to join as well. But of course Reese didn't want to be one of those who treat people like things. In Pana's opinion, if they kept working in the mine, they would just explode or die of exhaustion. She was shocked at Reese's opinion, but that wasn't what the elfess meant at all. Reese thought that Pana had no pride at all. Pana froze in place, remembering the words that had always told her that they were just ordinary slaves and that they were just labor. But the dwarves had pride, which begged to differ, thinking that they could just get away with it. In that case, Purse decided that they would just die. The dwarves that were then with Pana and defending themselves were killed by Purse. Pana smiled and said that this approach wouldn't help them if they wanted to survive. The elven girl exhaled sadly and replied that she was not at all like Mr. Pepperin, though he was also a dwarf. The girl didn't realize who Reese was talking about. Pana clarified that he was a dwarf, and Reese confirmed. She was sure that Mr. Pepperin would come to their rescue and kill them all. Pana turned away from Reese and lay down to rest. She didn't understand why a dwarf would suddenly come here. Reese couldn't let her mock Mr. Pepperin, but Pana was more familiar with the weaknesses of dwarves than anyone else. Being a weak race, they needed to be as smart as her to survive. Reese exclaimed that Pepperin herself was very strong, and Pana decided not to argue with her. Standing outside at night, it seemed to Lala that Mr. Pepperin was not well. The hero admitted that it was chilly, but they had already reached the VVS Ayujit, and Mr. Pepperin gave them the command to go forward. It had been 2 days since the mission of Pepperin and his company had started. Lala asked the hero how long it would take them to reach the shelter, but the hero figured it must be nearby by now. Lucy hoped that Reese was all right. In that case, they needed to distribute the main with rock, scissors, paper. Pachai replied to Fasia that it was nonsense, and of course he was the team captain. Harpy and Pachai argued. Pachai could not agree that Fasia could order him around, but she disagreed with him. After all, it was Fasia who had destroyed the last sanctuary. Lala lost her temper over their argument and shouted that they should have been thinking about Reese, not some nonsense. About an hour before Pepperin arrived at the Air Force shelter, Reese thought about how she couldn't take it anymore. Closing her eyes, she thought about how much she wanted to get back to her friends as soon as possible. From the second day on, Reese was forced to participate in mining. The work was so hard and long, and the fear of blowing herself up at any moment wore her down not only physically but mentally as well. Pana sat in the corner, talking about how it was long past time, but the elfess didn't understand what she meant. She had waited so long for this moment, but Reese didn't understand what Pana was talking about. A clicking sound was heard, getting rid of the handcuffs. Pana said she was getting the hell out of here tonight. She showed Reese a bunch of keys to her cell and shackles. Reese was shocked, not understanding where Pana got them from. The girl replied that she had stolen them from Purst, and she had to sweat, but she managed. But Reese thought that Pana wanted to obey the VVS and be with them, but of course she was pretending. She pretended to be obedient, started to like them, and then they let her walk around with them all over the sanctuary. They also told her all about the inside. So Pana thought it was their farewell party. Reese asked Pana to take her along, but Pana thought that Reese was already exhausted and she couldn't drag her along by force. But Reese disagreed with her. She wasn't so tired that she couldn't move. Also, unlike Pana, she wielded a sword, and if they had to fight, she could definitely use it. Pana thought that was too confident a statement for someone who had been captured and imprisoned in a dungeon. But if the bundle contained the keys to her shackles, she didn't mind taking Reese with her. While Reese tried to open the lock from her shackles, she decided to inquire about their plan. They had to have a concrete plan if they were going to escape from here. Pana said that first, they needed to visit the registration room, but Reese didn't understand what she meant. There were golem guards patrolling the base area, and if they saw them, they were dead. If they made it to the reception room and registered as members of the VVS, they wouldn't be touched. Every night after lights out, Purst and the others have been drinking in the control room, so the guards must be relaxed. If the girls could lure the golem out, it would be a done deal. Reese couldn't understand. If Pana knew so much, why did she procrastinate so long to escape? Perhaps she just wanted to escape with her friend, but Pana didn't understand what she was babbling about, saying that she didn't. She was going to get the hell out of here alone, but Reese insisted that she take her with her, so she had to agree. Reese chuckled and thought that Pana was very lonely, which Pana disagreed with. She threatened to wrap her back up if she didn't stop coddling her. The girl smiled and apologized. Reese suggested that in that case they should hurry to the check-in room. The elven girl thought Pana knew where to go, and her partner agreed with her. According to her, it wasn't far from here. On the way they heard the golem's footsteps, and Pana recognized the golem's footsteps. Hiding behind the corner of the wall, the girl noticed that it was coming straight here. Reese asked in fear what they should do, because in that case they would be found. Pana cursed the whole thing. Hearing some sounds in the darkness, the golem decided to check it out and went the other way. Reese crouched down and, panting heavily, recognized that it was close. Good thing they had come across an empty room at the right time and place. They decided that they would have to sit here for a while, when suddenly there was a sound that caught their attention. These golems were much nastier than Pana had imagined. With this kind of progress, morning would come faster than they would reach the place. She decided it would be best to move to the check-in room. Reese froze in place and called out to Pana, who asked the elfess to keep her thoughts to herself. Right in front of them sat a large human silhouette with a katana in its hand. The girls froze with horror. Meanwhile, Peprin's team approached the north entrance of the VVS shelter. Here they were to split into two groups as they had planned. Pachai and Fasia were to go inside in a minute. As soon as the alarm sounded, Peprin and the others would have to go in after them. Fasia and Pachai accepted the Lord's orders. Lala was counting on both of them, and Fasia asked to trust her. Before going inside, Fasia wanted to identify the captain, but Pachai refused to play rock, paper, scissors with her. Fasia decided that Pachai was afraid of losing to her in such a simple game, which made Pachai mad. He thought that was fine, and said that whoever wins first 3 times will be in command this time. In that case, he wouldn't say a word, and Fasia agreed. Peprin and his group were near the east entrance to the VVS shelter. Peprin asked Gus to open the doors, and Gus set to work. Once Lala and Ari were inside, they needed to go to the slave cells and rescue Reese. Once she was safe, they would go to the registration room and disable the security system. Lala was ready and waiting. Now, all they had to do was make sure they wouldn't be seen, and then everything would be fine. The exact cell that Peprin was thinking of was the one the bouncer was in. He was called Shin Triad, which is where the girls went. Coming to their senses, they tried to leave the room as quietly as possible without disturbing him. Closing the doors, Reese pounced on Pana, for she had talked about the place being empty. Pana apologized, saying that she didn't know that this was the room of Shin's bouncer. Anyway, they had to get out of here, and if he found them, they would be finished. Pana saw a cockroach crawling towards them. Unable to stand it, she screamed, but Reese managed to cover her mouth with her hand and asked her to be quiet, reassuring her that it was just a cockroach. Suddenly, loud noises and rumbling sounds were heard, which attracted the attention of the golems and terrified the girls. A dark silhouette with demon-like black eyes appeared right in front of them. Shin Triad stared angrily at the captives. Hugging each other, the girls decided that they were definitely screwed now. As Peprin's group walked through the east entrance, an alarm went off. They decided that Pachai had done a good job, and the hero decided to hurry in that case. The alarm caught Sin's attention, which turned back around. The girls couldn't even move from their seats out of fear. The bouncer said something about a sign of superiority, then headed in the other direction. Reese and Pana thought they were saved. At the north entrance of the VVS shelter, Pachai and Fasia played rock, paper, scissors. Fasia was thrilled that she had won and was captain. She asked Pachai to calm down, for it was only for once. She said he was Gloria Septim's real captain. Fasia looked at her subordinate and gave them the command to go forward. She ordered them to follow her commander-in-chief, and Pachai already regretted it. Fasia pointed her finger forward as they suddenly heard an alarm. They didn't understand why it went off, since no one had discovered anyone yet. Fasia assumed that Pein and the others had gotten through much sooner than they had. But they had said they would only go in after the alarm went off, hadn't they? In that case, all they had to do was go inside, and there was no point in staying here. Pachai and Fasia headed for the shelter. But no sooner had they gone inside than they encountered an enemy who came out to join them. He assumed that Pachai and Fasia were their runaway slaves and asked what they were doing here. Pachai smirked and called the enemy a loon. He asked Fasia not to slow down. Pachai announced a hunt for Asina, and the enemy's teeth grinned, not realizing who he was talking about here. Fasia puffed up her cheeks and thought it wasn't fair, because this way she didn't feel like a captain. Fasia shouted to Pachai that she was the captain here, and that it was the captain's job to hunt the enemy. Pachai replied to her that such matters were best left to his subordinates. There was no need for the captain to deal with such a little bastard, and Fasia accepted that answer. In that case, she decided that as captain, she would be the first to enter the shelter. She left the enemy on Pachai and ran inside. The VVS gang members shouted that the guys had no idea what they had gotten themselves into. He couldn't let Fasia go so easily, and yelled that she wouldn't leave so easily. But Fasia easily jumped over him, and Pachai blocked the enemy's blow with his sword. Fasia asked Pachai what should she do in that case. How would she get inside? But Pachai didn't know and just asked her to go already. Fasia ran away and the enemy looked angrily after her. He said that they just had harpy and kobold slaves who died, so they could be their new captives. But Pachai and the others had only one superior, and that was Mr. Pein, and they were only willing to obey him. The enemy replied to him that the kobolds were a bunch of idle men. Pachai had told him earlier that he had declared a hunt for him, but the enemy suggested he start with the frogs. Pachai clenched his sword tighter and interjected. Throwing himself at the enemy, he exclaimed that he certainly didn't need it. The little captives, meanwhile, ran further and further away, not realizing what the hell he was doing there. Shin kind of let them get away. But this guy didn't work for the Air Force. He's just a bouncer and a psycho warrior who's here for the sake of fighting the good guys. From the way he rushed over there, it looks like there's another uninvited guest or something. Reese immediately thought of it being Mr. Pein and their friends. Pana looked at the girl who was talking about it again. She didn't know what kind of king Mr. Pein was, but she was sure that there was no reason for him to come here. Reese got angry when Pana started mocking Mr. Pein again, but Pana didn't care because the registration room was already nearby. She suggested to end it before the golem found them, otherwise they would be screwed. The team of Pein, Lala, Gala, and Eri moved further and further away. The slave dungeon was just beyond the corridor ahead along the road. Pein figured it was just around the corner. The boy knew that if it was the same as Guma's, he was in this hall. Stopping abruptly, Pein ordered everyone to stay still. The signs ahead were false, and Pein drew his sword. Shin was already rushing towards the enemy and bared his katana for a strike. His first strike should have been to the back, but Pein blocked it. Lala was afraid for Pein herself, but the boy replied that he could handle him himself, and ordered the three of them to get to the slave cells. Lala and the others accepted the order, asking the hero to take care of himself. Shin grinned and couldn't even think of anyone being able to stop him from being hit from the back. But it was a technique that Pein had used many times, so he was already used to it. Shin was sure that he would never forget meeting an opponent as strong as him. The hero had never seen such a one before in his world, but they had never had a skirmish even on game days. With those words, Pein threw a punch at the bouncer who clearly didn't expect it. Pein admitted that he had already participated in more than 100 battles, which pleasantly surprised Sina. He became much more interesting, and he said that the hero is the strongest opponent in a long time. The enemy used an enhancement that made him grow a couple more arms. Pein was surprised that Shin wanted to use this technique. With many katanas in his hands, the enemy used the Kurenai technique, the mystery of the 6 swords. The deadly blades rushed straight at the hero. It was a powerful attack that had a 40% chance of hitting the target if the damage was more than a certain amount. It was almost impossible to avoid, and if hit by this attack, the health would be absorbed and it would be game over. With such a strong technique, there was only one way to defeat the enemy. The guy used a storm, but Shin decided it was nonsense. It was impossible to just stop him with ice magic. But the attack was successful and wounded Shin. Pein explained that if you hit first and make your opponent bleed, the ice attribute would be a very effective strategy. He discovered it after about 50 battles. Putting his sword to the throat of the bouncer, Pein declared that it was the end of their game. Shin smirked and praised the hero. He decided to end it that way. Meanwhile, Pana and Reese had already reached the registration room. Standing in front of the doors, Pana thought they were going inside and opened the doors ajar. Right in front of them sat Pursed, and was clearly already waiting for them. He had come here in the middle of the night to see what all the fuss was about, and it turned out to be about them. Pana was shocked to see the leader in front of her. Pana asked the leader in horror what he was doing here. It seemed to Pursed that their haste had played a very wicked trick on them. He wanted to remind her what she meant by that. Her wagging tail was just a pretense she had gone to in order to pull off her plan. Pana cursed him, realizing that Pursed was aware of everything. Reese shouted to Pana, who turned around to see the golem. Pana cursed it all, for they had come this far. Feather walked over to Pana and put his hand on her head. He felt sick at the thought of some slave trash trying to outdo him. He became furious, calling Pana an idiot. Tilting her head, he kicked the girl in the stomach from his knee. Reese called out to Panu, which twisted in pain. Leaving Pana alone, Feather headed towards Reese, calling her a rotten elf. He wanted to kill them both in one fell swoop. Suddenly, Pursed called out to Pein, which transferred his attention to herself. She told him that it was a mistake to leave the stones she held in this room. Pana ordered him to move, or she would blow them up. Feather smirked, for if she blew them up, she would surely also die. But Pana shouted that she'd rather die with him than by his hand. Pursed asked her to do it if she had the guts. Pana cursed him and swung a stone, assuring him that she would indeed blow them up. Reese yelled at Pana to stop, but her friend apologized to her. She had dragged Reese into all of this, but it was the only way they could see each other again on the other side. She put down the stone that flew down. But Pana was surprised when the stone fell and just rolled on the ground. Reese was shocked, thinking it would explode, and Pana also couldn't understand what was happening. Pursed laughed at the fact that Pana really thought they wouldn't take any safety precautions being surrounded by exploding rocks. Showing the ring on his hand, he called it their measures. This finger helped disarm all the explosive rocks within a 5-meter radius around him. Only the leader of the organization was allowed to have it. As long as he wore it, he had nothing to fear. And it could also be used to detonate an explosive with a small load, such as the explosive rock that Pana was holding. Showing Pana the middle finger on which the ring was worn, the stone in the girl's hands exploded. Pursed laughed as Pana fell to her knees. He was sure there was little pleasant about it, but he adjusted it so that her hand wouldn't be ripped off. Concerned Reese tore at Pani. Pursed wasn't the type to trust others 100% of the time, but he trusted her 50% of the time. Pana betrayed his trust, and asked him not to think about her just dying like that. Meanwhile, Pein was clutching his sword to his enemy's throat. Shin smiled, and he thought something was wrong. Pein thought about the fact that if the game killed him, the base leader would kill them all on the way, but Pein wondered what would happen if he left the enemy alive. After considering all the possible scenarios of events, he could tell that 9 out of 10 times out of them things would go very badly. He didn't know if they needed to proceed by trial and error since the situation was different from the previous game times. It had been a long time since the hero had tried to conquer the game, and with those words, he simply walked on, leaving Shin confused. Shin wanted to attack him from behind, asking what his opponent was doing. Pein said he wanted to do something, and he wasn't going to beat him. The ice was supposed to melt in an hour, and then he could do whatever he wanted. Remembering something else, the hero looked at the puzzled bouncer. He had thought about it while the game was still in progress, but Shin suddenly came up from behind and the hero's heart almost went into a heel. Pein asked the enemy to attack from the front as usual next time. The guy waved goodbye to him, and Shin smiled, noting that the dwarf was amused. The hero rushed forward and thought he would leave the slave trader prison and loyal to the others, and go to the registration office himself. Meanwhile, Fasia ran on her way, not understanding why there were no enemies here. As she flew past a turn, she stopped, and decided to see what was there. It was the prisons that were filled with slaves. She figured Reese had to be here somewhere. The prisoners inside saw a frightening silhouette looming over them, but Fasia broke down the bars and asked if Reese was among them. The girl from the race of goblins looked at Fasia in surprise that she decided to introduce herself as Captain Glorious Septum. She asked the captive if she knew a girl named Reese. The girl replied to the harpy that she was not in this dungeon, and Fasia asked her to escort her there in that case. Fasia only then remembered that they needed the key to the dungeon, wondering where to get it. The harpy smiled and promised to help the captives, then ran off and left the puzzled girls behind. Fasia screamed when she thought she could just make the passage without the key. Pein decided it was time to end things with Pein and for good. Reese begged for forgiveness, but the leader replied that they would choose another elf mate. He took a swing at Pein, and Reese shouted the name of Pein-sama. There was an explosion, and in an instant, Pein saved Pein from the enemy's blow. Pein couldn't understand what had happened, and Pein looked at her savior the same way. Reese exclaimed to Pein-sama, who was relieved that Reese was all right. He apologized for the fact that it took them so long to get there. Pein looked at Pein, who was also a dwarf. He hadn't seen her kin in ages, and Pein agreed with him in surprise, thinking that this was the same Pein. Pein looked at Pein, who in his opinion was nervous. Pein could not understand how Pein knew his name and who he was. The hero introduced himself as King Glorious Septum and gave his name. He could not forgive him for interfering in the affairs of his friends and people. Pein wondered what the king of the asshole state wanted from the leader of the VVS. The hero replied that he had come here to rescue his subject named Reese. At the same time, he wanted to destroy Pein and free all captured enemies. Pein became furious and told the dwarf that he could only dream of this. But before Pein could even attack the hero, Pein immediately cut off his right hand, which shocked everyone. Screaming in pain and clutching his hand, Pein fell to his knees. This was the kind of pain that the hero believed he was inflicting on his slaves. From anger and hatred, Pein's veins showed on his forehead. For the suffering he brought to Reese and his kin, he had to pay with his life. Reese ran up to Pein and asked him to wait. It was true that he treated everyone like things, and before her eyes people were dying at his hands. His cruelty knew no bounds. But that was why if Pein just killed him like that, it would make him look like a VW's. Pein didn't understand what Reese was saying, because if that scumbag died, they would only be doing this world a favor. Maybe that was true, and yet Reese felt that killing him was not the best option. In his time as a player, Pein had also had similar thoughts when his subordinates killed enemies on his orders. Now that the game had become a reality, apparently his subjects were beginning to think about it as well. If the number of his subjects kept growing, he wouldn't be able to solve problems with the previous methods. Reese apologized to Mr. Pein and began to bow to him. She felt very sorry for daring to impose her opinion on him. But Pein replied to Reese that she was right and that they are Glorious Septum. Even if they are oppressed, they should not forget to be merciful to their opponents. This time, the hero decided to keep alive at Reese's request, and told Pein that they would take him to the Spielding family's domain. Meanwhile, Lala with Gus and Iri raced down the corridors, not understanding why there were no slave cages. They had to hurry for Reese's sake. That was why Gus had suggested earlier that they go back to the back so they wouldn't get lost. But Lala shouted to him that they were Glorious Septum, and there was no such thing as going back in their vocabulary. He turned away from them and asked them to be quiet. Looking at the broken grate, the group members couldn't figure out what the hell this was about. One of the men asked the prisoner who had done this, but they didn't really know anything themselves. Quietly peering out of the corner, Iri assumed it was the slave cells. Gus realized they were thugs from the Air Force gang, and he also wondered why the cell had been breached. He had to assess the situation first, but when Gus turned to Lala, she was gone. Lala had already thrown herself into the fray, asking her enemies where Reese was. She couldn't understand how they dared to do that, and ordered them to tell her where she was. Gus decided to let all the slaves out first, and Eri needed to treat their wounds. The hero wondered how Reese and Pana ended up in the registration room. Pana explained that she and Reese were trying to escape. In that case, it made sense to Peperin, and the alarm only went off because they were discovered. Reese was upset about this and apologized. But Peperin didn't think she should have apologized, and that it was for the best. If they waited here, the golems and the VVS forces would rush in, and they would be able to get rid of everyone faster. The hero asked the gnome girl her name. Pana introduced herself, and Peperin thanked her for trying to save Reese. Pana thought he was a gnome like her, but took Purse down with one punch. Reese was telling the truth, and he was really strong. Plus, she noticed his looks, which were good. Peperin wondered if she was okay, and Pana blushed. Approaching her, he put his hand on her forehead, thinking she had a fever. Pana was embarrassed, but shouted that she had no fever and that she was fine. Peperin wanted to say that she had misunderstood him. Featherin stood behind the hero and laughed, holding his severed hand in his hand. He realized that these bastards of trash races he really cared about. Applying the magic of his ring, Featherin wanted to make him regret getting involved with him in the first place. Peperin was shocked that Purse could still move. But then Fasia came to him and kicked his enemy in the face with her foot. Pana and Reese were confused when they saw Purse lying on the ground. The harpy was happy to meet Peperin herself. She said she was looking for the key to the cells here, and met them. Fasia hugged Reese and said that they had been looking for her. She was insanely happy that Reese was safe, and the elf answered her in the same way. Peperin asked the harpy what about Pachai, and Fasia proudly stated that he was her subordinate. So he was wearing petty bipeds, and she was the commander. That's why she went here. She also boasted that she had slain a great many enemies on the way here, and only the boss was left. But the one she had just taken out was Agitorides, something Fasia didn't know about. Still, the mission was accomplished, and Fasia was so happy about it that she still didn't understand why she was here. Pana was shocked at how happy the harpy was, but Reese thought she was awesome. Now that they were done, the hero suggested they cross paths with Lala and the others. It was already boring for Fasia, and she ended up getting one easy one. Pachai, meanwhile, was sitting on an accomplice of the VVS gang. He had heard of the weaker dogs fuming the loudest, but apparently his enemy didn't have the strength for that either. In that case, he decided to see how things were going inside. Lala, Gus, and Eri went into one of the cells and couldn't figure out where Reese was, because she was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly footsteps were heard behind them and Reese called out to a distraught Lala. It was Reese and Mr. Peperin with the pomade, so the two teams united. Lala hugged Reese and was happy that she was okay. Gus noticed that Mr. Peperin's group had found Reese earlier. The hero replied that it was a long story, and asked if they had finished freeing the slaves. Gus said that they had released all the slaves and treated their wounds, but it seems that they hadn't been fed for a long time, so they had absolutely no strength. The hero decided that this was fixable. First, he wanted to get everyone outside and then look for something at the local food warehouse. If they found anything of value there, they would take everything with them. Pana replied that she knew one place well, for she had done various jobs and cleaned up. In that case, Peperin asked to escort them, and Pana asked to rely on her. Lala was furious. How dare she speak to Mr. Peperin like that? Just because she belonged to the same race with him did not give her the right to speak like that, and that meant nothing. Lala thought that Pana wanted to seduce him, but Pana angrily replied that she thought nothing of such a thing. When they reached the warehouse and opened the doors, they saw a pile of food and crates. With tears in their eyes from pleasure, they all started eating. Hero, along with Gus and Pachai, decided to take Purse and the rest of the ringleaders to the Spaldings. Lala, Eri, and Fasia were to escort Reese and the others to the village. The captives did not understand what they should do now, and Pepperin replied that from that moment on they were no longer slaves and were free. But there must have been some among them who had nowhere else to go. Such people could go with Lala and the others, which could guarantee their safety. Reese looked at the pensive Pana and asked her what was wrong. But Pana stood still and didn't know what to do. Reese asked her in that case to go along with her if she had nowhere to go back. Pana didn't want to admit it, but since it was what Reese wanted so badly, she was fine with it. The girl took the hand of a surprised Pana and pulled her along.